Hi, welcome to another episode of Austin Archer's YouTube exclusive content.
YouTube exclusive content. Okay, hello everybody. Let's do one of these. Before we get started here, I want to let you know that I will be talking about the movie Edington, which is currently in theaters, and I will at some point be doing spoilers, but not for a while. The first big chunk of the video is going to be spoiler-free for Edington. I might spoil some other movies that came out earlier than Edington, like there might be minor spoilers, but the movie I'm gonna mostly be talking about is Edington, and there will be a spoiler section for that, but you will be warned. Also, it's been a minute since I've done a YouTube exclusive, right? What's with that? Well, I've been doing episodes of People Pleaser, the podcast that I do here on this channel. You might have seen those. I've been directing a music video for my friend Kelly Abarca. We just wrapped that. I've also been really focusing on my Patreon exclusive content. I've been really working hard on building my Patreon page up, patreon.com/AustinArcher, because I recently changed my lowest level subscription to just $1 a month, and that community has been building nicely over there. If you find what I do to be valuable and you want to be a part of that paywalled community over on Patreon, I decided to make it really, really easy for you. It's $1 a month. Can you believe that? It's $1. For an entire year, it's like $10. You get a discount if you sign up at the annual rate, and it's like $10 for the entire year. My Patreon is $1. That's a big thing that's been going on in my life. You can find the link to my Patreon at the description in this video. It's $1. But all right, let's get into this video, shall we? Part 1, the modern auteur. Okay, auteur filmmaking. This is a term that kind of gained popularity in the back half of the 20th century. The idea of the film being made from the author's perspective. It's the writer, director, written and directed by Quentin Tarantino. But it's the idea that the film, the story being told, should be funneled through the perspective of like one person, the authorship of that person. And we have many modern auteurs who are working right now. We've got Christopher Nolan, Jordan Peele, the Daniels, who made Everything Everywhere All at Once, Greta Gerwig, and Ari Aster. There are obviously others. There are definitely others. Of course there are others. And of course I wish there were more people who weren't just white guys. Like, the Daniels, one of them isn't white, Jordan Peele, and you got like Ryan Coogler. But yeah, unfortunately film is still largely a boys club, and a white boys club at that. And I do wish that we had more modern auteurs that were not just white men. But I bring up Ari Aster because that's who we're mainly talking about today. That's whose movie we're talking about. We're talking about the movie Edington that he recently was the writer and director of. This is the fourth film by Ari Aster, and what I'll say about Ari is, love him or hate him, I'm glad he has a creative home with a producing partner like A24. I'm glad that he has several producing partners who believe in what he wants to do as a filmmaker, the kinds of stories that he wants to tell. I'm glad his producing partners are open to him telling different kinds of stories and not just pigeonholing him as a horror filmmaker since he started out in that genre. I personally feel like Hereditary is a modern horror masterpiece. I also really, really like Midsommar. I will talk about Beau is Afraid in the next section of the video. But I think so far, Hereditary is Ari Aster's only film where audiences mostly all agreed that it was pretty great. Every film since then has gotten something of a mixed response from critics and audiences. The response tends to skew positive, but people are getting increasingly unsure about how they feel about the work of this particular auteur. I feel very much the same way about Alex Garland. McFarlane's work. Like, love him or hate him, I'm glad he gets to make the movies that he makes. I'm glad he's found producing partners who believe in his voice as a writer-director, sometimes as just a writer. So I don't know. I called this part 1 of the video, but it still feels like we're kind of in the prologue. It just feels like table setting. Like I'm just sort of telling you how I feel about auteur filmmaking, and the gist of my thoughts is I'm glad that people like Ari Aster get to make the kinds of movies they like, even when those movies don't fully work for me. And I also still wish we had more diversity in the space of writer-directors who are finding homes with different producing partners, more women, more people of color, queer people, more disabled people in these spaces telling different kinds of stories. But yeah, I think that basically sums up my thoughts on section 1. So let's go ahead and move on. Part 2, Edington, spoiler-free edition. Okay, so I recently saw Edington, and I will say this, I liked it more than Beau is Afraid. I don't like the movie Beau is Afraid. I knew 2 hours into Beau is Afraid, maybe even 90 minutes, that I never wanted to watch it ever again. It was so weird to sit in the audience and be checking my watch and be like, when is this movie going to be over? Beau is Afraid, by the way, is 3 hours long. It's a 3-hour odyssey. The thing about Beau is Afraid is there isn't a straightforward plot structure. It's not just like, Beau is this man, and here's the day that he's having. It kind of starts out that way. It starts out like Beau needs to do some things. He needs to accomplish some tasks, but the world Beau lives in keeps impeding him from being able to accomplish those tasks. And the fact that he has crippling panic disorder is also getting in the way. But it's only that movie for like an hour. And then the next 2 hours are just Beau completely descends into parallel dimensions of anxiety and fear, and we just go through like all of these different little vignettes of like, what if this scary, disturbing thing happened to Beau? Then what if Beau went to this place and these crazy people were there? Like, here's my thing about Beau is Afraid. I get it. I have panic disorder. I live with panic disorder. There have been many stretches of my life where I had daily debilitating panic attacks. So within the first 30 minutes of watching Beau is Afraid, I was like, gotcha. Honestly, like, great work. I think what Ari Aster manages to do in the world of Beau is Afraid is capture quite well, maybe better than I've ever seen captured on film, what having panic disorder actually looks like and feels like. But that's sort of it. Like, that's sort of where Beau is Afraid begins and ends for me, is Ari Aster was like, can I visually display to the audience what it looks like to live inside the brain of a person with debilitating panic disorder? And he did, but then the movie just kept going. Like when it was at the 2-hour mark, I was like, please be done now. I think this is long enough. I got it. All that being said, going back to section 1 of this video, I am still glad that Ari Aster was allowed to make that movie. And I think the only reason Ari Aster was allowed to make the film is because he had done such a good job with his first 2 outings with Hereditary and Midsommar, that his producing partner said, hey, this is a weird script, but we trust you and we're going to let you do it. And again, I'm glad he did get to make the movie. And also, there are a lot of people who really, really, really like this movie. All that is to say, I enjoyed Edington considerably more than I enjoyed Beau is Afraid. Edington is at least a movie. We're introduced to these characters, this happens, because this happens, and then this thing happens that throws a wrench into everything, and now the main character has to deal with that. It's a straightforward narrative instead of just sort of a series of acid trip psychedelic vignettes. Again, this is the spoiler-free section, so I'm just going to give the very vague plot synopsis that this is a film that takes place at the surge of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 in Edington, New Mexico, and it deals with the cultural and sociopolitical vibes of that period. It is very much so a sociopolitical commentary in the tradition of movies like Network, or more recently, Adam McKay's movie Don't Look Up, which I spoke about recently on an episode of People Pleaser. And for me, as a person who does sociopolitical commentary kind of professionally on the internet, this is my job. Sometimes I try to make it entertaining, sometimes I just try to make it straightforward. But as a person who does that, there was a lot in this film that really worked for me. There was a lot that landed and rung true. There was a lot of satire that I found to be actually quite biting and accurate and really funny. Joaquin Phoenix is incredible in this movie, but surprise, surprise, right? Like, the guy's great. Even in Beau is Afraid, which I hate, Joaquin Phoenix is very, very good. He's giving a really bold, brave, energetic performance, and not much changes here. Like, I mean, you know, like Joker Folie à Deux. No one liked that movie. Joaquin Phoenix was very good in it, though. I actually liked that movie a lot more than most people did. More thoughts on that from me if you want to watch the episode that I did on the Wonder podcast about Joker Folie à Deux. But Joaquin Phoenix is really, really great in this movie. And like, from an actor who's always doing great work, this was sort of a standout that stands out from the crowd of his great work. It's one of those performances that's like, this for me is, you know, like a top 10 Joaquin Phoenix career performance. Now, why some audiences might be bumping on this film, in my opinion, is some of the approach to the politics could potentially come across as centrist or like both sidesing in a way that's not particularly helpful or accurate. It almost feels like Ari Aster wants to do this sort of South Park-esque takedown of both sides and talk about how both sides are really crazy. And listen, as a totally libbed out leftist progressive guy on the internet, I found a lot of his commentary about the left to be accurate, biting, and often very funny. The problem is, if I'm looking at this film as though it is Ari Aster's perspective, as though Ari Aster is telling me through this screenplay what he thinks and what he experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic, it can feel sort of weirdly and potentially irresponsibly centrist. It can feel like he's trying to make a movie that is interested in doing overt sociopolitical commentary, but he is shying away from the challenge of taking an official stance. But in order to try to craft a film where both sides are just as harmful, or both sides are just as deranged, just as detached from reality, just as crazy, you sort of have to disingenuously or dishonestly hyperbolize the craziness on the left and simultaneously downplay the craziness of the rhetoric from the right. Because, in my opinion, reality does not skew toward the center. Reality skews heavily toward the left. Reality skews in favor of progressivism. In the American Civil War, it wasn't like there was just, oh, crazy people in the North and crazy people in the South, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The South wanted to own people as property, and the North said, we're not going to do that anymore. The North was right. They were more correct. I think it's been long enough that I can talk about this without getting canceled. But once we started normalizing going back to restaurants, going back to movie theaters in late 2020, early 2021, and we started tiptoeing out of our homes and started getting more comfortable being around each other again, still wearing masks the whole time, I did notice things that to me just didn't make sense and were kind of objectively stupid. And I think it's things that we can all agree in hindsight didn't make a lot of sense. The rules around going to a restaurant were you have to wear your mask when you walk into the restaurant, but the moment you sit down at your table, you're allowed to take your mask off, because I guess COVID-19 has a lot of respect for people when they're dining, and the virus would never dare enter your body while you're enjoying your shrimp scampi. It always just kind of seemed like one of those weird TSA rules where it's like, what are we actually doing here? Are we actually making air travel safer by taking people's toothpaste away and throwing it in the trash? If the reason why you're taking that away from me is because that's a bomb that could potentially blow the plane up, why are you throwing it in a garbage can right next to you? Don't you want to like get the bomb squad in here and have them with the big heavy Jeremy Renner suits from the Hurt Locker on and grab it with like special tongs and put it in some case that can contain the explosion? Like, if it's a bomb, then don't just throw it in the trash. If it's just toothpaste, then let me have it. And I can say all that without being like a COVID denier. I definitely am aware that COVID-19 was real, and I think so is Ari Aster. I'm definitely aware that millions of people absolutely died, that hospitals were completely overwhelmed by this pandemic, that it was not some global conspiracy to just control us, that the government wasn't just trying to, demonstrate how much control they have over us and make us sheep. It was a real thing that actually happened, that still exists. Like, people are still dying of COVID. I talked to my friends who were doctors, and I trusted what they told me more than what conspiracy theorists on the internet told me. And that's sort of how Ari Aster's world feels in the movie Edington. It kind of feels like a world where the left is full of people who are ultimately fighting for the right things, but they're kind of doing it for all the wrong reasons. It's largely performative and self-serving and kind of cynical. It's like, like when everybody turned their Instagram pictures into a black square for Black Lives Matter, but then it wound up having that inverse effect where it kind of co-opted the hashtag Black Lives Matter. So people who were actually trying to use that hashtag to get eyes on important information when, new events of police brutality would happen, those videos would get buried, and instead it would just be a bunch of black squares that people would see when they would go to the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And Ari Aster's definitely poking fun at that. And that stuff is, it's an accurate and deserving target. And sort of conversely in this world, the right seems to be populated by people who are largely fighting for the wrong things. Like, they're misinformed about what's going on in the world, but they're doing it from a place of feeling like what they're doing is right. Like they feel like their heart is in the right place. Joaquin Phoenix's character sees a world where to him it's like, I don't think it's right to treat your neighbors like they're these diseased people that need to stay 6 feet back, that where we can't communicate with each other. Some people have a hard time breathing, some people have asthma, and I don't think that's right. Ultimately, he's coming at it from a perspective of being largely misinformed, a perspective that is potentially really harmful at a time when a lot of people were dying worldwide of this highly communicable disease that we were still learning about actively. But he feels like his heart is in the right place. And so it can feel like that's what Ari Aster's personal politics are in this film. That like the left is full of people who, from a optics standpoint, fight for the right things, but they largely do it for self-serving, cynical reasons. And the right is full of people who are misinformed and maybe not fighting for things that are actually ultimately good for society, but they're doing it because they believe in their hearts that they're actually trying to be more humane in a way. Like they believe in connection and they value what's being taken from them by health mandates. But here's the thing. I don't actually think that this story is being told to us through Ari Aster's eyes. In fact, I'm pretty sure that it's not. The reason why the world of this film feels so centrist is because we're not actually getting a fair perspective. We are getting the perspective of our main character, of Joaquin Phoenix's character, Sheriff Joe Cross. And again, you could say, well, then he needs to do a better job of making that clearer. And that's going to lead us into part 3, the paradox of sociopolitical commentary. Hey, that's the title of the video. We've gotten to that part of it. So listen, there's this paradox that exists in movies or TV shows or books or social media content that tries to tackle some form of sociopolitical commentary. And I'll admit, maybe paradox isn't the right word, but I haven't been able to think of a better word, so that's the one I'm going with. But the paradox or problem or inherent contradiction, whatever phrasing you prefer, that I'm talking about is how when you are writing sociopolitical commentary, there's kind of no Goldilocks spot that can be hit where everyone is going to feel like you balanced it perfectly, like you were just prescriptive enough but held back enough to let the audience make up their own mind. If you are very clear about your perspective as the author, people are going to feel sometimes like that is overly didactic, overly prescriptive. They're going to feel patronized, talked down to. They're going to feel like you made it too easy, like you're telling them what to think. They'll say that your writing lacks nuance or subtlety. They'll say that it's way too on the nose. They'll feel like you're hitting them over the head with it. But here's where the paradoxical part comes into play, because if you are too vague, if you hold back too much, if you are too generalized, people will criticize you for that as well. They will say it is irresponsible of you to write a story that is clearly trying to make some kind of political message and not tell us specifically what that message is. They will say that your writing is cowardly, that you're chickening out, that you're shying away from the challenge of taking a meaningful stance. And the reason why I can't really find a better word for this than paradox is because no matter how you do this, it feels like there's some sort of problem with it, because even if you try to get that Goldilocks spot right in the middle where you get it just right, and a good example to me is something like Andor, where it's like there's a really nice mix here of a story that is rooted enough in allegory. It's not just like Edington is just like, hey, this is Edington, New Mexico in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic, but Andor is allegorical, right? It's like, no, this is Star Wars. It's a galaxy far, far away, a long time ago. You know Star Wars. It's Luke Skywalker and the Force and Jedi and stuff like that. And it's removed enough from our literal reality that the overt political commentary that does exist in the show kind of balances out with that. But still, even with that, I mean, to me, Andor is incredibly obvious what Tony Gilroy is saying, and Beau Willimon and the other writers for Andor. It's incredibly obvious what their politics are, what their political messaging that they are intending with the show is, and still people on the right watch that show and go, oh, I'm pretty sure the left are the empire, like, right? Like that obviously, like, I can't tell you how many different times I've seen conservatives post on the internet, like, how could anyone from the left watch Andor and not understand that they're the bad guys? Don't ask me how they arrive at that place. I mean, the answer is just their media literacy is zero, right? Like, they are just completely incapable of interpreting and synthesizing stories and understanding them properly. But the point is, like, it doesn't matter how well you try to balance your political messaging, or how subtle you try to make it, or how overt you try to make it, there will always be a problem with it to someone. Alex Garland's film Civil War got the same criticism that Ari Aster's Edington is getting right now from a lot of people, where they said, the problem with this movie is you're not committing enough to a side. You're not committing enough to saying something. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Why make a movie like this where you're very clearly trying to delve into the world of American politics and then not take a stance, be so vague and sort of stand back and be like, who am I to tell you what to think? The movie is about journalism, and specifically photojournalism. The movie is being seen through the perspective of a group of photojournalists. Their job is not to turn to the audience and say, hey, just so you know, here's what's going on in this civil war, and here's who the good guys are, and here's who the bad guys are. Their job is just to go into this battlefield, this, war zone, and just take photos and document what they see. And that's all Alex Garland is doing as the filmmaker in that movie. He's just taking us into the war zone with them and letting us draw our own conclusions. Similar to the way that Ari Aster is not telling us his personal thoughts on the COVID-19 pandemic, he's showing us the COVID-19 pandemic in this one small town in America through the perspective of this centrist, libertarian, right-leaning sheriff. But even though that's the case, Edington does have some pretty clear politics that you can see from the filmmaker in it, and so does Civil War. Like, I'm going to spoil a few things in Alex Garland's Civil War, so if you haven't seen that one, spoiler alert for Civil War. I'm going to talk about a few spoilers in that movie. Spoiler alert. So in the movie, America is having a civil war between the Western forces of California and Texas. A lot of people were like, what? California and Texas? That would never happen. But also, like, the movie starts out with Nick Offerman, who is the president of the United States, and he's giving this address. He's doing this like sort of filmed address from the White House. And from the jump, like if you're paying attention to what he's saying, he's Donald Trump. It's not even particularly subtle. The way that Alex Garland writes the speech, it's Trump. He's saying things like, a few hours ago, our military carried out what many people are calling the most amazing military operation in the history of this country. And he's like rehearsing the speech. The movie starts with him rehearsing the speech. And he's like, many people are calling it the most amazing. Many people are calling it the most amazing. Well, a lot of people are saying this is the most amazing. And he's like rehearsing it. And you're like, that's Donald Trump, 100%. Like that's how Donald Trump talks, right? What we do find out in the movie is he was a demagogue and an authoritarian despot who refused to leave office. He stayed in office for a third term, and he tried to rule over the country as a dictator, and so the Western forces broke off. Now, you might say it's not realistic that the Western forces would be made up of California and Texas, and like, valid. You've got a good argument there. It would probably more likely be like California and Washington and Portland, and Oregon, and then maybe like New York. But in this movie, it's California and Texas. Suspend your disbelief. But the reason why there was this rift, the reason why, like the inciting incident for this civil war is that this authoritarian right-wing despot refused to leave office. Again, who does that sound like? And at no point in the movie does it feel like Alex Garland is trying to tell the audience that Nick Offerman is the good guy. For instance, the whole plot of the movie is that the Western forces are moving on Washington, D.C. to go kill Nick Offerman and take over Washington, D.C. So even though these journalists don't have a quote-unquote side, they're like going on this mission to document the president of the United States being killed in the White House. And that's how the movie ends. The movie ends with the Western forces breaching the White House and with Nick Offerman's Trump stand-in president in the Oval Office, like pissing his pants, terrified, begging for his life. And he looks at one of the journalists and the journalist says, hold on, before you kill him, can I get a quote? And Nick Offerman says, please don't let them kill me. And then the journalist says, yeah, that'll do. And then they kill him. The politics of the film are there. The fact that people watch the movie and were like, he's chickening out by not saying it. He's chickening out by not taking a stance. It's like, I don't know what movie you watched, but do you think he's intending for the audience to be able to be neutral about Jesse Plemons in that scene? And if you do, okay, I just think that that's kind of bad media literacy, and that's on you. I did a whole video on Civil War as well, if you want to watch that. But the question remains, would Civil War be a stronger piece of sociopolitical commentary? Would the writing be stronger if Alex Garland had been more overt, if he had left no doubt as to what his personal politics are and what his personal thoughts on his fictional Civil War are, if he had left no doubt as to who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, who they are stand-ins for, would it be a better film? And that takes me to another piece of sociopolitical commentary that I really like, Adam McKay's Don't Look Up. That movie is incredibly unsubtle. Adam McKay is very clearly on the side of left-leaning, progressive climate science. Like, he wants climate reform now. He wants it yesterday. Adam McKay is screaming at the heavens in that movie. Everybody who denies climate science is insane and killing us, and I feel crazy for having to point this out. All of the people who just refuse to acknowledge this blatant problem, this comet that's heading toward Earth, the ignorance, the way that people bury their heads in the sand and not have to deal with it, the fact that he has a whole group of, like, a movement of people who wear hats that say don't look up. Like, it's incredibly unsubtle, and a lot of people didn't like that. Even people who agree with him were like, why does he have to be so prescriptive with it? Why does he have to tell me exactly what to think? He's delivering information I already know. He's delivering information I don't disagree with, and it feels like he's yelling at me as though I disagree with him. I feel like I'm a writer who lives more often in Adam McKay's camp. I'm not a particularly subtle writer when it comes to the politics that I infuse into the stories that I tell or into the content that I make, and I don't apologize for that. I want the audience to know exactly where I stand understand exactly what my opinions are. I want conservative people and right-wing people in the audience to feel uncomfortable. I want conservative people to know that they are not welcome in my audience, that their ideas are abhorrent to me. I want them to know that they are not friends of mine. I wrote a show that's currently playing in Salt Lake City at a theater that is a piece of sociopolitical commentary that comments on the idiosyncrasies of life in Salt Lake and the politics there and the weird power dynamics of the Mormon church and the way that it controls and influences culture and the countercultural aspects of that weird state, and also about the national politics of what's going on in our world today. The show has been very well reviewed by all of the reviewers that reviewed it, and I enjoy that. The audiences that go to see it seem to get a kick out of it. People are laughing when they're supposed to laugh. They're getting catharsis from it, which is what I wanted. But obviously, being a piece of sociopolitical satire, it's not going to land the way that I want it to for everyone. I'm going to read an excerpt from this one review that we got just to sort of drive home what I'm talking about. But not all the satire lands. In one particularly troubling scene, two of the husbands idolize Elon Musk and admit they want to have the courage to perform a Nazi salute like him. I don't think joking about such a thing is ever funny, and this moment didn't feel satirical so much as jarring. Even the most committed conservative voices I know wouldn't align themselves with that kind of overt fascism. If anything, many conservatives are in denial about the extremism brewing in our country, not openly celebrating it. I know plenty of Trump supporters who believe I'm the one who's been brainwashed. The moment may have aimed for shock satire, but instead it blurred a line that shouldn't be played for laughs. First of all, I want to say that this is just one paragraph in an otherwise glowing review. This reviewer gave us a very, very, very kind, very nice review. The show is a parody of Utah-based reality television, and a subplot of the show is that the husbands of the wives that are the main stars of this reality show, the husbands are all slowly becoming radicalized into being Nazis because, you know, we live in an era where, unfortunately, Nazis have taken over the country. And I personally just couldn't find a way to write a show that's supposed to be commenting on our current state of affairs politically in America without talking about the fact that, like, the infiltration of white nationalist propaganda and white supremacy and just the overt acceptance of, you know, Nazi propaganda at the highest levels of the government. And personally, I don't think that it would be responsible of me to write a show that's supposed to be commenting on our current politics and not talk about the fact that Elon Musk did a Nazi salute, and most conservatives are either hand-waving it away or, you know, just saying that they don't mind that that happened. I definitely disagree with this reviewer when they say even the most conservative voices I know wouldn't align themselves with that kind of overt fascism. Maybe this person doesn't know people who would willingly align themselves with that kind of fascism, but I would just say maybe you need to meet more conservatives, because I definitely have met those people who would gladly align themselves with that kind of fascism, and that's why I put it in the show. But my point is, my writing is about as unsubtle as it gets when it comes to sociopolitical commentary and satire. I'm not even using metaphor. I'm just like overtly talking about, hey, these husbands are getting radicalized by AI online to be Nazis, a thing that is actually happening. And I'm trying to find a way to play it for laughs, not because I think it's harmless and funny, but because I'm trying to find a way to talk about it that is more approachable and palatable. That's sort of the goal of social satire. But in this reviewer's opinion, it was irresponsible of me to include that. I don't know that the show is better if I take that out. If I try to step back and be a little bit more like Trey Parker and Matt Stone and go, I'm gonna grill both sides, and I'm not gonna talk about the overt Nazi stuff because I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable. I'm not sure that the show would be saying what I want it to say. I'm not sure that the show could be considered more or less responsible with or without it. Coming back to Andor, I think Andor is very, very well balanced and also very overt. overt. I think that the messaging, the anti-fascist messaging is very out there, on the nose, like very clear for anyone paying attention. And again, many conservatives still didn't get it. And so the question is posed, like, would that show be better if Tony Gilroy had people in the Empire wearing hats, red hats, that said, like, make the galaxy great again? Maybe that would make it more clear. It would make it harder for right-wingers to misinterpret what the show is about, but would that make the show better? Would that make the storytelling better? I would argue, probably not. I don't think that's going to make that show better. And again, I would argue that, like, the politics are already there. It's already clear enough. And I guess what I'm saying is, I'm not sure that the goal should be to cater to people who have zero media literacy anyway. If you can make a show where the politics are as clear and as obvious as they are in Andor and still have conservatives not get it, then, like, all that shows is that they're not going to get it no matter what. I think that's the danger that people want to avoid, right? Is they're like, well, we don't want them to accidentally think that the bad guys in the story are us and the good guys are them. That, like, Jesse Plemons is supposed to be the good guy. Alex Garland has a responsibility as the storyteller to make it clear that what Jesse Plemons is doing is wrong. And I would just argue, like, it is clear. And the only way that someone wouldn't get that is if they had piss poor media literacy. So yeah, anyway, you know, socio-political commentary, it's hard. It's hard to write. It's hard to get it right. It's hard to find the right balance. And I don't know if there even is such thing as the right balance. I kind of feel like no matter how you do it, there are always going to be people who feel like you maybe could have done it a little bit better. But let's get back into Edington, shall we? Part 4, getting back into Edington. Spoiler edition. That's right, it's the spoiler time. This is the Edington spoiler section of the video. It's the spoiler. Oh, you guys, it's spoilers.
Spoiler warning, you guys. Spoilers.
There's gonna be some friggin' spoilers.
My Patreon is $1 a month.
Okay, so similar to Garland's Civil War, similar to Gilroy's Andor, I do believe that Ari Aster's Edington has pretty overt and clear politics for the most part. I think that even though we're seeing the story through the perspective of Joe Cross, the central character, this, like, you know, right-leaning libertarian guy, I do think that the director's politics are still there. And I'm not going to put words in his mouth. I'm just going to tell you what he said about the film and about his personal politics in this Variety article. He said, "What you'll see in the film is that I have some frustration towards one side of this ideological battle, but I'm terrified of the other side. And part of my frustration with that first side is that it's failing to meet the threat of the other side. This film is about a bunch of people who are in the same situation, and they're all boring, and they're all going at each other, but they're all subject to the same forces and the same big power that is working on them." So that could seem like a pretty frustratingly vague answer to the question, what do you think, Ari? What is your interpretation of the story that you've written? As the author, what is your perspective? What are your personal politics? What is your message that you want the audience to come away from? It could feel like he's being intentionally, deceptively vague and kind of chickening out of answering the question. He's just kind of going like, oh yeah, I think if you watch the movie, it's in there. And, you know, maybe he's getting this from Christopher Nolan. Christopher Nolan sort of famously talks all the time about how he avoids telling people what he thinks his personal interpretation of his films are, because early on in his career, he was at some event and somebody asked him his personal interpretation of the film Memento, and he said, listen, this doesn't have to be your take, but I'll tell you what I think. And he gave them the answer. And then I think it was like his writing partner or somebody came up to him and was like, never do that ever again. Don't tell them. Let them figure it out, because now everyone's going to say, well, the definitive answer has been given to us by the director, but just like let them come to their own conclusions. Don't tell them what they should think about the movie you made. I do think it's in there. I don't think this is actually a non-answer. I think actually this answer is giving us a lot more than he even needs to. I think if you pay attention to just the events in the film and what the different characters do, when he's talking about how one side kind of annoys him, that it's frustrating that they're not able to rise to meet the threat of the other, and that other side actually fully terrifies him, it would be weird if it wasn't that the left is the side that annoys him and that he feels like they need to do a better job rising to meet the threat of the right, and the right is the side that terrifies him. It would be weird if it was flipped. Based on the events that happen in the movie, it would be weird if he was saying, I think when you watch the movie, it's pretty clear that the left poses this terrifying existential threat, but the right's just kind of annoying, and I wish they were doing a better job of tackling the threat. The events of the film, I don't think, work with that statement. So now we're going to get into some explicit events of the film. Spoilers, spoiler warning.
My Patreon is $1.
Okay, so we are seeing the world through Joe Cross, our main character. We begin with him. Here's the problem with Joe Cross is he's a total piece of shit, and he's woefully unaware of what a huge piece of shit he is. Joe Cross is like the center right-leaning libertarian character who just thinks of himself as like the way that all centrist libertarian people think of themselves is like, why is everyone fighting all the time? Why is everyone arguing? Why is everyone yelling at each other? Can't everybody see that like we're all just human beings and we're all just trying to get along here? You know, it's the guy that's like, I don't get why no girls want to go on dates with me. I'm a nice guy. I don't get it. Like, he thinks of himself as just a pure-hearted, nice guy who just wants everybody to get along. But everything he does in the movie is something a complete piece of shit with zero self-awareness would do. We start the movie with him watching a YouTube video that's a tutorial about how to convince your partner to have a baby with you when they don't want to do that. That's not good, Joe. Don't do that. If your wife doesn't want to have a baby, don't watch lists where you can psychologically figure out how to manipulate her into becoming a vessel for the child that you want. Maybe you and your life partner have incompatible wants. Maybe you want children out of a partnership and she doesn't, and you shouldn't be together. And you should find a new partner who also wants to have children, who has similar life goals with you. Or if that's not the option you want to go with, maybe just respect her fucking decision to not have kids because she's the one who has to carry the fucking child. Maybe talk about adoption. If she still doesn't want to do adoption, talk about getting a fucking dog. And then we see like on his computer screensaver is just a big picture of his wife. So again, in Joe's mind, he's like, she's the center of my universe. I love her so much. But the way that he actually shows his love is by watching videos behind her back of how to psychologically manipulate her into doing things that he wants that she doesn't. Pretty much immediately, we see that Joe is the kind of guy who's having a really hard time complying with statewide health ordinances around COVID. He gets approached by two police officers from the Pueblo Nation, which is the kind of the neighboring jurisdiction to where he lives in Edington. And, you know, it's funny. It's like they approach him in the middle of the desert and he's just in his car by himself and they tell him, you need to wear your mask. We have a mandate in our territory where you need to wear a mask. And he's like, what the hell? I'm in my car by myself. But the problem is Joe Cross is like this the entire movie. Like he just feels so put upon by the simple request to ever wear a mask in any situation, no matter where he is. Doesn't matter what the scenario is, Joe just categorically refuses to ever put a mask on during this global pandemic. Sometimes his reason is kind of like he has a reasonable argument. It's like, I'm sitting in my car by myself in the middle of the desert. I remember thinking this during the pandemic. When I would see people driving around in their cars by themselves and they had a mask on, I'd be like, what do they think COVID-19 is? Do they think that it just like lives on the passenger seat of their car? But you know, the movie tries to make Joe sympathetic by saying, well, Joe has asthma and it's hard for him to breathe. And when he wears a mask, it makes him uncomfortable. Again, I found this sympathetic because as a person with panic disorder, COVID-19 fucked me up all different kinds of ways. I had gone a year and a half without having a panic attack. I got sober in 2018 and my daily panic attacks like completely dried up and went away. And it was kind of this miracle that happened in my life. It was amazing. And then all of a sudden this pandemic happened where, there was this communicable disease in the air that made it hard for you to breathe. And people were going to the hospital on ventilators. And every day I started psychosomatically convincing myself that I couldn't breathe. And so that started happening in the COVID-19 COVID-19 pandemic, and I'll tell you, wearing masks did not help. As a person with panic disorder, it fucking sucked to add a muzzle to the layer of already feeling like my breathing was being constricted. I had to go and buy a pulse oximeter that I would carry around with me in my pocket, and I would check my blood oxygen anytime I felt like I wasn't getting enough air, just to make sure that whether it was in my head or whether I needed to go to the emergency room. But I relate to this, like that for some people, wearing the masks was physically uncomfortable. I did it fucking anyway. When I went to the store, I wore masks because I wanted the other people in my community to know that I cared about their safety as well, and that I was willing to make myself physically uncomfortable to serve the greater good of trying to participate in this communal effort to stay as safe as we could. I knew that everybody around me felt existentially terrified, that everybody was going through the same anxiety and fear I was going through. And when I would go out, whether it was to the store or, the post office or the airport, and there was that one fucking asshole who didn't have their mask on, I'd always just look at him and be like, what makes you so special? How can you possibly be out here and see that 99 out of 100 people around you are all participating in the same thing? Most likely, most of us don't like it. We don't actually even like the way it feels or the way it's affecting our breathing, but we do it anyway, and you're saying, not me. The rules don't apply to me. And that's who Joe Cross is. He's that asshole. Yes, he has asthma, but he can fucking breathe through a mask. And if it gets bad, he can lift his mask up and do his little inhaler. It's really not that big of a deal. But Joe, like many conservatives during the pandemic, decided to go full victim mode and make this his big cause. That the government tyranny was here. This is overreach. This is not okay. Telling people that they're forced to wear their Fauci face diapers. And that's the kind of guy that Joe is. And again, he thinks he's doing the right thing. But anytime there's a worthy cause in the film for Joe to get behind, police brutality, the Black Lives Matter movement, the fact that there actually were millions of people dying from this communicable disease, Joe doesn't give a shit about it. Joe always prioritizes his own personal comfort. That's why he wants to manipulate his wife into having a baby that she doesn't want to have. This leads Joe to deciding he's going to run for mayor against Pedro Pascal's character, Ted, and because he thinks that the masks are an overreach and Joe's going to free us from the tyranny of the masks. The problem is, Joe doesn't even fucking talk to his wife about this decision to run for mayor. He just announces it on a live stream on Facebook without consulting his wife, and what we find out is that his wife has a history of severe mental illness, and her doctors have told her and him that she needs to avoid public stress. And so knowing that he has this wife who's vulnerable to, this severe mental illness that she lives with, he goes and announces publicly that he's going to subject her to the scrutiny of a public mayoral race and campaign without consulting her. And she's rightfully pissed about it. As the societal anxiety and unease of COVID continue to ramp up, and the era of the George Floyd protests and the ramping up of the Black Lives Matter protests, as that all continues to visit Edington, Joe is always on the wrong side of every single issue. All he sees is a bunch of cynical, self-serving people who want to be seen on social media as being part of it. And again, you could make an argument that Ari Aster, as the author of the story, is also saying that, because a lot of his characters who are participating in the Black Lives Matter protest are seen to be doing this for just social clout. And again, that is to a certain extent an accurate social commentary that needs to be made, that there are a lot of performative, self-serving activists on the left. And I'm glad that Ari Aster's movie calls them out. But again, at the end of the day, the cause that they're fighting for, the cause that they're choosing to throw their weight behind, even if it's performative and self-serving, is a just cause. And Joe couldn't give less of a shit about it. All Joe cares about is the fact that the Black Lives Matter protests are getting in the way of his mayoral campaign that he shouldn't even be doing because it's causing his wife great distress. And he's also his wife, by the way, is getting sucked into a dangerous QAnon cult that is run by Austin Butler. And instead of dealing with what's going on at home, all the misinformation that his mother-in-law and his wife are consuming at home, Joe's just focused on I'm going to become mayor and I'm going to make it so that nobody nobody has to wear masks. And by the way, the whole movie, there's like this homeless man that's walking around town that keeps coughing on everybody. And it's pretty heavily implied this homeless guy for sure has COVID, and he's definitely giving it to everybody in town. And Joe's definitely going to be patient number 1. The homeless guy's patient 0, but Joe, the guy who refuses to wear his mask, is definitely going to get a face full of this homeless guy coughing, and he's going to, get COVID and spread it to everybody. But it gets worse. As Joe's mayoral campaign is not going the way that he wants it to go, he decides to falsely accuse his opponent, Pedro Pascal, of sexual assault. He goes on TV, on a live stream, and he calls him a rapist. He says, this guy raped my wife when she was 16 years old. And the next day his wife gets on the internet and is like, no, he didn't. That's a lie. My husband made that up. And again, like, this is what conservative people do, right? Like, they convince themselves that their end goal is righteous enough that it can justify any means. Their very ends justifies the means driven people. So Joe thinks the ends of me becoming mayor and freeing everybody from the tyranny of masks justifies any means I need to employ, up to and including falsely accusing my opponent of sexual assault. But it goes further. Joe kind of spirals out and freaks out about this, and he winds up killing the homeless man that's been going around town coughing on everybody. And in the process, he gets the COVID that guy has, dumps that guy's body in a river, and then goes to his opponent's home and murders his opponent and his opponent's son in their house, and then walks into their house and spray paints "No justice, no peace" on the wall to blame it on Black Lives Matter activists. Then Joe frames his black deputy that works for him at the police station for the murder. He just pins it on a black guy. Joe fucking sucks so much. So this is why I say, given just the events of the film and what the different characters do, when you look at this statement from Ari Aster, where he says, when you watch the film, what you're going to see is that I definitely sympathize with one side of this ideological divide more than the other. One side I find kind of annoying, but the other absolutely terrifies me. It's pretty clear that the criticisms that he's making of people on the left are sometimes the left can engage in performative activism, where the activist's own personal ego and sanctimony is more important than the actual cause or message, and that's problematic and annoying and unhelpful. And it also bothers me that kind of performative activism does not have enough strength to adequately rise to the level of being able to combat the existential threat posed by the other side, the Joe Crosses of the world, the ends justifies the means people who are willing to engage in all manner of utter depravity. I think it's pretty clear that of the two sides, he finds Joe Cross's side, the more right-leaning side, the more heavily misinformed QAnon side, to be the greater existential threat. Here's where this movie might drop the ball. In the final act of the film, while Joe is walking around town clearly with COVID, he's clearly got COVID, he's running a fever and he's coughing all over everybody, not wearing his mask because Joe sucks. We see a private jet that's full of people who are dressed up like Antifa agitators, and they're heading toward Edington. They show up and they do this night of coordinated, militarized guerrilla violence that's centered at Joe. And Joe basically has to go Rambo and go into a gun shop and have this crazy shootout in the third act with these, deep state, heavily funded Antifa agitators. And the result of this confrontation is one of the agitators comes out and stabs Joe in the forehead several times with a knife. And while he's doing that, this kid who's sort of been this performative activist the entire movie comes out from behind a car and shoots the Antifa guy and kills him. And then that kid basically becomes Kyle Rittenhouse. That kid becomes a hero and gets his own podcast and makes all this money. And I thought that was really funny and really spot on. Joe stays alive permanently. He's a quadriplegic now who can't talk. He's nonverbal and he's in a wheelchair, but he's now the mayor of Edington, and he's gotten everything that he wanted, except his wife has left him for the cult, the Austin Butler cult. He now just lives with his mother-in-law and has to sleep in a bed next to her and her lover. And it's implied heavily that they're doing the hanky-panky in bed next to him while he can't move. It's also implied heavily that her lover is Joe's caretaker and that this caretaker abuses Joe. There's like a moment where he's like putting Joe on the toilet and Joe like isn't doing what he wants him to do and the guy smacks him and then is like, sorry, I'm sorry. And it's implied that Joe is being abused by his caretaker. And so like definitely things don't work out for our central character. The reason why the commentary gets a little muddy here is I'm still not sure what exactly Ari Aster is trying to say with this whole storyline about the deep state funded Antifa pretenders. Like these people who show up in Edington pretending to be Antifa. They show up on a private jet. To me, this is a storyline that if I were a right-wing person with zero media literacy, I could watch this and go, is he saying that the deep state is real here? Is he saying that both sides are equally crazy and, sort of elevating the craziness of the left and downplaying the craziness of the right and saying that the real threat is this big, the bigger existential threat of the moneyed interest, the billionaire class that's pitting us against each other? Is that the message? And it's here in this quote, right? I'm going to read again where he says, "They're all boring and they're all going at each other, but they're all subject to the same forces and the same big power that is working on them." This is where, in my opinion, I could use a little more clarity from the author. But again, going back to our early section about the paradox of writing sociopolitical commentary, maybe Ari Aster writes a version of this that's more on the nose and it's more clear who these outside agitators are, these heavily funded agitators that are posing as Black Lives Matter activists, as Antifa, who they actually are, and he's more clear about it. And maybe that version of the screenplay is worse. Because I also, at the end of the day, don't disagree with the idea that there are bigger forces than the Joe Crosses of the world and the average Black Lives Matter activists, who are just protesting in the street, that there are these bigger forces who are interested in keeping us pitted against each other. And I don't think that Aster is directly saying, oh, this is definitely George Soros who's funding these people. I think he's more saying there are puppeteers, there are bigger forces at play who like when we fight each other, who have a vested interest in keeping us fighting each other. Because there's this whole other storyline in the background of the entire film where there's just this plant that is getting built in town, and we never learn a whole lot about it other than that it's really important that this new power plant gets built. And when Joe is finally made mayor and he's quadriplegic at the end of the film, he's at the ribbon cutting ceremony for this new plant. And it's sort of showing all along when Joe thought he was involved in the fight for Eddington's soul, his town was really being run and the strings were really being pulled by whatever corporation was making this plant in town. You could also say that because the movie is being seen through the perspective of Joe Cross, this third act finale where it ramps up into this militia of Antifa radicals showing up in Edington and having this shootout with the sheriff, that this is his libertarian nightmare, right? That we're now seeing the world that he believes in, that he believes that that everything that the left does is cynical and self-serving and that it's also probably funded by dark money. This idea that the No Kings protest was all paid protesters. This talking point about how everyone who shows up at left-wing events, they're all paid protesters by dark money. You could say that this third act is that. But I do feel like Aster is sort of intentionally backing off and not giving us a very clear definition of who these people are. And you could say that that's a problem with the film, or you could make the argument that it wouldn't matter even if he did make it incredibly clear. People might have a problem with that, or they still might not get it anyway. There's also just some open-ended questions or threads that I don't think get paid off very well in the film. Early on in the film, it's said that Pedro Pascal's wife left him and his son, and we don't know why. And that gets brought up several times where people are like, hey, where's your wife? What happened to your wife? How come your wife left? And that thread just dies. Once Pedro Pascal and his son are murdered by Joaquin Phoenix, the movie just never at any point returns to that question of who is Pedro Pascal's wife? Why did she leave him? What was that all about? And maybe that's not important, but it's also one of those things where for a writer and a director who's so detail oriented. Like, there is so much in this movie. There are so many details. One of my favorite details in the entire film is like Joaquin Phoenix is driving around town in his sheriff, car, but he's decked it all out with mayoral campaign slogans. Like, he's just got all these signs all over his car for his mayoral campaign. And one of the slogans on the car says, "You're being manipulated," and "your" is misspelled. It's spelled Y-O-U-R. Emma Stone, who plays Joaquin Phoenix's wife, she leaves him at one point in the movie. Of course she does. He's fucking terrible. And she leaves him to go be in a cult with Austin Butler because Austin Butler is young and hot. She goes in this message that she puts out to the world where she says, "My husband's lying. I was not assaulted by Pedro Pascal's character." She's about to say what actually did happen to her. She's like, "The truth about what happened to me is," and then Joaquin Phoenix turns the message off. And then that same clip plays again at another point in the film. She's on like a TV and that same clip is playing again. And he cuts the message off again at the same place, which to me goes, okay, so there's something about the back half of that message. And the movie never pays that off. It's just sort of another one of those open threads that's like, why'd you open that up if you never wanted to do anything with that? And it's weird for a director and a writer as specific as Aster is, in my mind, to open that up and not pay it off. The other thing that I personally just wish had paid off better is the whole Chekhov's gun of the COVID of it all, right? From the beginning of the movie, the first thing we see is this unhoused man, this vagrant, wandering into Edington, muttering to himself and coughing. And it's like, here comes COVID to this small desert town. And the whole movie, Joaquin Phoenix's character is insisting that COVID doesn't exist in Edington, that we don't need to wear masks because COVID isn't happening here. But this vagrant is here and he keeps coughing on everybody. And then the first person to visibly get COVID from this vagrant is Joaquin Phoenix's character. And then he murders that guy, throws that guy in the river. And throughout the whole third act of the film, Joaquin Phoenix is very visibly sick and he's like openly coughing on everyone in town. And it just felt like, surely there has to be a scene in this film where we get to see Joaquin Phoenix in a hospital on a vent. It just feels so clearly like the movie is ramping up to being that the conclusion of the film is there's going to be a mass spreading of COVID in Edington, and it's going to be his fault. This self-serving, selfish, misinformed idiot who was just so concerned about his personal discomfort around mask wearing that he wound up giving everyone in his town the disease. And that like we would see something like what we saw in Central Park in New York, where there were just like, tents that were full of bodies and stuff. And like the movie would end with Joaquin Phoenix, he's fighting off the Antifa guys, but then he collapses from an asthma attack and he wakes up in the hospital and there's just like a mass outbreak of COVID and all of his neighbors are all in beds on ventilators or something. But that doesn't happen. Like, he gets stabbed in the head by the Antifa guy and then he just wakes up as a quadriplegic like a year later, and it's never implied that anybody else in Edington ever got COVID. That whole thread is just kind of dropped. And that's a weird thing for me because it sort of feels like what Aster is saying as the writer and director potentially is like, okay, Joe was actually right about this. Like, COVID wasn't actually that big of a deal. And if that is what Aster is saying, I definitely disagree with that. I'm not convinced that that is the message he's intending to go with here. I think what's more likely is Aster was really, really determined with this film to not give the audience easy answers. Like, Aster referenced the movie Network in this in his construction of this film, and in lots of interviews he talked about Network, and he said, my problem with Network is it starts telling the audience at some point how they should feel, and it starts giving them conclusions and answers to the problems being posed. And I think probably he was in the writing process for this, and it's like the obvious place this is all leading to is Joaquin Phoenix's character is going to get COVID, wind up on a ventilator because he has asthma, and he's going to spread COVID to all of his friends. And all of his, good-natured attempt to like free people from the tyranny of masks was ill-fated, and he wound up making everyone sick. And maybe he just felt like, I don't want to do the obvious thing. I want to subvert the audience's expectations and take the third act into this crazy, right-wing delusional fantasy where like Soros-funded Antifa radicals show up in town and have a shootout with the sheriff. And I don't know. I feel like if the movie's about COVID, you kind of dropped the ball with the whole COVID thread there. Like, what's the point? What's the point of Joaquin Phoenix's character even getting COVID if it doesn't mean anything? Okay, so all that being said, I ultimately like the film. I enjoy the film. If you enjoy the way that I talk about movies, you can find more of my commentary on film over at the Wonder Podcast. That's a podcast that I do here on YouTube with my friend Kramer England, where we just talk about movies and we just do stuff like this. And, go follow that podcast if you're not already subscribed to that channel. But yeah, ultimately, what I can say about this movie is I respect it. I respect the attempt. Sociopolitical commentary, it's difficult. I found it thought-provoking and challenging. I think that maybe there are some threads that aren't paid off as satisfyingly as I would like them to be, but maybe that's because I prefer my sociopolitical commentary to be a little bit more specific and maybe a little bit more predictable. Who knows? Do I think that what he's doing here is irresponsible or harmful? Not intentionally, no. But as we all know, impact can matter more than intent. Like this whole Sydney Sweeney jeans ad and the debate over whether or not they intentionally were trying to make a Nazi dog whistle about eugenics. I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it definitely was intentional. I think that as the evidence piles up, it's like, oh no, here's a new spot, and now she's got her German Shepherd with her. Why does it have to be a German Shepherd? Oh no, here's a new spot, and she's specifically talking about her blonde hair and blue eyes. Oh no, remember when she did a birthday party for her mom and they were all wearing MAGA hats? Oh no, the VP of American Eagle has come out and it really looks like this is the thing they were trying to say. But let's just pretend that it was an accident. Let's pretend that it was just like they were just trying to make a double entendre about how jeans, Genes, sounds like the word jeans, Jeans. Let's say that it is an innocent mistake. Impact over intent, right? The intent doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, it's been received the way it's been received. It's kind of like, sometimes companies will design a logo that accidentally looks like a dick or something suggestive, and it's a logo that probably a bunch of people saw and signed off on before it made it to the public, and it's just one of those things where it's like, you don't notice it until the first person notices it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it, but sometimes it's already a public-facing thing before anybody catches it or sees it. And again, it's it doesn't matter whether you intended to make your logo look like that or not. It looks like what it looks like, and you should probably address it. But in storytelling and in film and in movies and plays, social media content, this is why I find this to be incredibly complicated and sort of paradoxical, because it just feels like there is no right way to make the intent land perfectly as the author wants it to. There's always going to be someone who feels like it's irresponsible or potentially harmful to not be more clear about the messaging. There's always going to be someone who thinks it's irresponsible or who to be as clear as I sometimes am, that they're like, hey, back off. Don't talk about the Nazis and stuff and Elon Musk doing a Sig Heil. I kind of think that maybe it's just the price of entry when you engage with sociopolitical commentary, sociopolitical satire, that some of the stuff is going to land and feel accurate, and some of the stuff might feel a little bit confusing, that it might be hard to understand what the intent is, that some of the stuff could feel maybe potentially irresponsible, even if it's not intended to feel that way. And that's because this stuff is subjective, right? Everything is filtered through the eye of the beholder. So whether or not it's irresponsible, whether or not it's harmful, whether or not it's patronizing or didactic or clear is just a matter of perception. So I guess that's it. I guess that's all for this one. And thank you. And that's the video now. Okay, thanks for watching. Thanks to my Patreon patrons. Shout out everybody. Patreon.com/Austin Archer. Remember, it's $1 a month. For a year, it's $10. You get a discount. It's $10 for the whole year. How crazy is that? Linked in the description. Go check it out. Thanks to all the Patreon patrons. You guys are amazing. We're doing fun stuff over there. Lots of Patreon exclusive content. Lots of perks. Lots of good stuff. Okay, go check it out. And goodbye now.